Hello everyone. We are going to take a look at Egypt as seen by Abraham, Joseph, and Moses. This will also include some time being spent on working out the timeline of this period of the Bible. And for the sake of time, we'll also be doing more of an overview once we actually get to the visual aspects of what they would have seen. So everything we'll be taking a look at will also have been present when Joseph, Mary, and Jesus went into Egypt during the New Testament. So this is the timeline I worked out for what we will be looking at. We'll spend some time going through how I worked out the dates before jumping into the details of Abraham, Moses, and Joseph. Some important dates to note on here is 1949 BC is when Abraham was born. He goes into the land of Canaan and Egypt around 1874 BC. Isaac was born in 1849 BC. Jacob is born in 1789. Joseph is born in 1698. And Moses is born, going down a bit, in 1526 BC. He returns to Egypt in 1446, which is the same year as the Exodus, and they enter the land in 1406 BC. So I wanted to show how I worked these dates out, and my starting point was this verse, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, and some historical records and archaeology. So to begin, let's read from 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. And it came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord, the house of Yahweh. So historians place this verse, this 4th year of Solomon's reign, in either the year 966 BC or 967 BC. This is largely based on the historical records of Shalmaneser III, one of the kings of Assyria. So it's important to know that this is the 4th year of his reign, when this 480th anniversary of the Exodus took place. So all of my math is coming from the year 966 BC rather than 967. I'll admit that this was a completely arbitrary decision. I just had to pick one of them. So the next thing I had to consider was Acts chapter 13, verses 17 to 22. Because this is often viewed as a contradiction in the Bible, since it appears to give a different time frame than 1 Kings chapter 6. So after some digging, I feel pretty confident I have an explanation about how to reconcile these two verses. So reading this passage, it says, "The God of this people of Israel chose our fathers and exalted the people when they dwelt as strangers in the land of Egypt, and with a high arm brought he them out of it. And about the time of 40 years suffered he their manners in the wilderness. And when he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he divided their land to them by lot. And after that he gave unto them judges about the space of 450 years, until Samuel the prophet. And after this they desired a king, and God gave unto them Saul the son of Kish, the man of the tribe of Benjamin, by the space of 40 years. And when he had removed him, he raised up unto them David to be their king, to whom also he gave testimony, and said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart, which shall fulfill all my will." So we are going to take a quick look at a few points Paul makes that will not only show how he is actually in agreement with 1 Kings chapter 6, but also clarifies the king's account. So Paul discusses a few key events in verses 17 through 20, where he says, "The God of this people of Israel chose our fathers and exalted the people when they dwelt as strangers in the land of Egypt, and with a high arm brought he them out of it. And about the time of 40 years suffered he their manners in the wilderness. And when he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he divided their land to them by lot. And after he gave unto them judges about the space of 450 years, until Samuel the prophet. So in verses 17 to 18, he talks about the Jews leaving Egypt and their 40 years in the wilderness. And then in verses 18 and 19, he talks about the conquering of the land taking about 450 years. So I think all of the events he refers to, including the time after this, is part of these 450 years. Because the conquering of the land does not actually end until David's reign, which includes the conquering of Jerusalem. And one of the reasons I think that this is being included is because Stephen groups all of these events together in Acts chapter 7, verses 44 through 47. So in this passage, we read that Stephen says, "Our fathers had the tabernacle of witness in the wilderness, as he had appointed, speaking unto Moses, that he should make it according to the fashion that he had seen, which also our fathers that came after brought in with Jesus into the possession of the Gentiles, whom God drave out before the face of our fathers, unto the days of David, who found favor before God, and desired to find a tabernacle for the God of Jacob. But Solomon built him a house." So we see in verse 45, Stephen talks about the conquering of the land as a period of time that started from the entering of the land to the days of David. So Paul, who is known for his difficult language, refers to this period in much the same way. And he begins by talking about how this period of about 450 years covered the conquering of the land, starting with Joshua and ending with David. And it could be that even though he refers to it as the times of Samuel the prophet, he's including the times of Saul and David because he anointed them as kings. So once you add the 40 years of the wandering, you get a total of 490 years. So I would like to point out that Paul says about 450 years back in Acts chapter 13. And every translation I looked at uses this phrase, including the King James, the RSV, the NASB, and the NIV. Paul is clearly talking, I believe, in round numbers for the sake of his audience. So if you take about a decade off of this number, you get the 480 years that is referred to in 1 Kings chapter 6. So with all of that established, let's do some math. Here's how I determine the dates that I'll be using. So if you go back 480 years from the 4th year of Solomon's reign, we get the date of the Exodus as 1446 BC. The 40 years of wandering tells us that the Jews entered the land in 1406 BC. And knowing that Moses lived 80 years before the Exodus, we learn that Moses was born in 1526 BC. So as we go through this, we'll see what was happening with Egypt at these times. So there were still a few timeline issues that I felt needed to be worked out. And the next thing I looked at was how long the Jews were in Egypt. And to figure this out, I started with Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. This says, "And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. So this verse tells us that the Jews were to be persecuted for 400 years prior to the Exodus, which gives us a date of 1846 BC. So now that we know what this time frame is, let's find out what some of the details are. And Paul gives us some of these details in Galatians chapter 4, verses 28 through 29. This says, "Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now." So we know that he that was born after the flesh is here in this verse is Ishmael, while he that was born after the Spirit is Isaac. So the persecution that we read about is when Ishmael started to persecute Isaac. When did this begin? Well, fortunately, we have some more details provided for us in Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 through 9. So in Genesis 21, verses 8 and 9, we read, "And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking." So, a few things important to note here is that Ishmael began to persecute, to mock Isaac when he was weaned. And commentators believe that Jewish children were weaned between the ages of 3 to 5. So this mocking that took place, we know that it was, whatever it was strong enough for Sarah to have Abraham remove Hagar and Ishmael from the household. So this was more than simply some name calling and kids being kids, but it would have been something pretty severe that was going on. So going to figure out the more details about the age of Isaac at this time, we can see in 2 Chronicles chapter 31, verse 16, which tells us, "Beside their genealogy of males, from 3 years old and upward, even unto every one that entereth into the house of the Lord, the house of Yahweh, his daily portion for their service, in their charges, according to their courses." So this verse tells us that that men were counted in the genealogies from 3 years old and up. So I believe that this connects well to the Genesis 21 passage and tells us that Isaac would have been weaned at the age of 3. So the next thing I figured out was when Abraham was born. So in Genesis 21, verse 5, we read, "And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born unto him." So doing some of the math we've already worked with, we can go from 1846, when Isaac was weaned, go back 3 years earlier to when he was born, which brings us to 1849, and then 100 years before that brings us to 1949 BC, which tells us Abraham was born in 1949 BC. So here's the timeline again. We see 1949, Abraham was born. 1874, he goes to Canaan. 1849, Isaac is born. 1698, we see that Joseph is born. 1668 is when Joseph stands before Pharaoh. 1526, Moses is born. 1446, Moses returns to Egypt and the Exodus takes place. And then in 1406, the Jews enter the land. So we see that there is almost a 200-year gap between the death of Jacob in Egypt and the Exodus. So this leaves us with a challenge presented by Exodus chapter 12, verses 40 to 41, which tells us that Israel sojourned in Egypt for 430 years. So let's turn there and see what exactly it says. So this passage says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel, who dwelt in Egypt, was 430 years. And it came to pass, at the end of 430 years, even the selfsame day it came to pass, that all the hosts of Yahweh went out from the land of Egypt." So this passage makes it clear that the Jews sojourned in Egypt much longer than the 2 centuries or so on my timeline. Verse 41 makes it clear that the Exodus happened on the self-same day of the 430 years. So this is clearly an exact number that we were working with. So I struggled with how to reconcile this for a while, but a brother at my ecclesia, at the San Luis Obispo Ecclesia, pointed out some basic math which I hadn't even considered. So let's go back to the timeline. So if you look at the date of the Exodus, 1446, toward the bottom of the timeline here, and you go back 430 years, you get 1876 BC, which is roughly the time that I have for Abraham going to Egypt. So my timeline is obviously off by about 2 years here. So there's still a little bit of work to do in order to clean this up. However, a case can certainly be made that the nation of Israel's beginning actually begins with Abraham. And it could very well be that Abraham's sojourn in Egypt is the beginning of the sojourn of Israel in Egypt. Because another factor to consider is the 400 years that the Jews were persecuted in a land that was not their own. And we looked at this earlier. This persecution began in 1846, which I have highlighted here. And this is when Ishmael persecutes Isaac. And this actually works out perfectly because it takes place 30 years after Abraham goes to Egypt. So I realize I still need to work out that 2-year discrepancy, but it's a much smaller discrepancy than the one that I had just a couple slides ago. So now let's look at the scriptural origin of Egypt. And we see this in Genesis chapter 10, verse 6, which says, "And the sons of Ham, Cush and Mizraim and Phut and Canaan." So here, the name Mizraim is actually translated as Egypt in many other translations. And knowing both names, knowing that it's also translated as Mizraim, gives us an interesting little insight into Genesis chapter 50, verse 11, which takes place when Jacob is being buried. And this verse reads, "When the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, 'The Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning.' That is why the place near Jordan is called Abel Mizraim, which means the mourning of the Egyptians." So you can see that even in Canaan, this name Mizraim was being used in place of Egypt. We get some more details back in Genesis chapter 10, verses 13 and 14 about Mizraim, when the verses say, "And Mizraim begat Ludim, and Anamim, and Lehabim, and Naphtuhim, and Pathrusim, and Casluhim, out of whom came Philistine, and Caphtorim." So my apologies if I got the pronunciations wrong there. But we see that these are some of the descendants, these are the descendants of Mizraim. And we know that from archaeology and history that Ludim and Casluhim became groups of people that inhabited ancient Egypt. So Egypt was one of the first and quickest civilizations to develop after the flood and the Tower of Babel. So this slide and the next few are going to go over a few historical terms and eras of ancient Egypt and some of the challenges that come with working with Egyptian history. So there are a few distinct periods in ancient Egypt. We have the Old Kingdom, the First Intermediate Period, the Middle Kingdom, the Second Intermediate Period, and the New Kingdom. So the intermediate periods were times of political upheaval in ancient Egypt, where the previous era had collapsed politically, and there were often multiple dynasties reigning at the same time. So these are the five main periods of ancient Egypt. The Old Kingdom begins when Egypt was united as a single nation. So there are a few major challenges to establishing a timeline with early Egyptian history. And it's a matter of debate among Egyptologists regarding dates. There's multiple timelines that you have to kind of work your way through. And one of the reasons for this is that timelines for nations are often established by comparing them to their contemporaries, the nations that surround them geographically. And Egypt in the early kingdom and the first intermediate period was a pretty insular nation. They had very limited interactions with the other nations at this time. So as a result, historians are unable to really have a set and fully reliable timeline for Egypt during this period. But they do start to have stronger interactions with surrounding nations once they emerge from the first intermediate period and the 11th dynasty was established. So the Middle Kingdom dates have generally been thought to be pretty reliable, but it isn't really until the New Kingdom that Egyptian dates can really be counted on. So another challenge to Egyptian history is that the Egyptians have had a tendency to ignore or change things in their historical record if it made Egypt look bad. Battles that were lost would either be recorded as a victory or they were just simply never mentioned at all. One of the best known cases of this happening was actually in the New Kingdom when Ramses the Great warred with the Hittites. Both nations record an overwhelming victory against the other at the Battle of Kadesh. But historians today generally think that this battle was actually a draw rather than a victory for either side. And it was also common for pharaohs to take credit for what their predecessors had done. And this continued through much of their history. Ramses the Great was particularly notorious for carving his name over the names of other pharaohs in historical documents at the temples and other places. So now let's talk about Egypt when Abraham visited there in Genesis chapter 12. So the dynasty that seems to be the best fit for Abraham's visit would have been the 12th dynasty around 1874. And during this time, Pharaoh Senuseret III was the pharaoh. The capital had just been moved to a city called Amenemhet Ichtawi. This would have been during the Middle Kingdom after the first intermediate period. So the details of his reign seem to fit pretty well with the details that the Bible tells us. He was the fifth pharaoh of the dynasty, and he reigned from 1878 BC to 1839. And his Hellenized name is Sesostris III. So Senuseret III had a pretty strong military. He had conquered the Nubians, he had successfully invaded Syria, and he was also campaigning in Palestine, in the land of Canaan. So while he did defeat a few cities, he was more concerned about getting tribute and loot from them rather than expanding his borders to Canaan. This was actually a pretty common tactic for the Egyptians, that they didn't actually want to go outside the land of Egypt. They just wanted the money that they could get from defeating them. So their strength would have been pretty intimidating to Abraham and to all the people of Canaan. This would have been one of the main reasons, I believe, why Abraham was afraid for his life when he went to Egypt, because he would have known how strong the nation was. It's also important to note that during the early reigns of the 12th dynasty, it was becoming increasingly common for the people of Canaan to migrate to northeast Egypt. So this is likely how Abraham had heard that Egypt was a good place to go during the famine that happened when he had moved to Canaan. That it was well known at this time that Egypt was a good place to go, that it was a fertile land, that there was food to be found there. So when Abraham went to Egypt, what are some of the things that he would have seen during his time there? Well, things we know that existed at this time were the pyramids. These were actually built during the Old Kingdom, so they would have been around for quite some time by the time Abraham got there. The Sphinx was built at this same time. He would have seen the Nile and how fertile the land was around it. He would have seen that the nation of Egypt was an incredibly wealthy nation, he would have seen their military strength, and he would have seen their idolatry, and this would have included all the temples that they had. So these were all things that would have been present during his time in Egypt. So let's go into a brief history of the pyramids and the Sphinx. So Abraham arrived in the 12th dynasty of Egypt, but the first big pyramid in Egypt was actually built in the 3rd dynasty during the reign of Pharaoh Zoser. So this was a step pyramid, so it would not have been a smooth pyramid like the pyramids that we normally think of, especially the ones in Giza. So it's also important to note that the pyramids were actually used as tombs, that these gigantic structures were built for people to be buried in. So this kind of gives us an idea of the resources that the pharaohs had available to them and just kind of the egos that they had at the same time. So the 3 great pyramids were built for the pharaohs Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, and they reigned during the 4th dynasty. Khafre also had the Sphinx built, and Khufu's is actually what is known as the Great Pyramid. And the Great Pyramid was 481 feet tall. By comparison, the ziggurat of Ur, where Abraham was from, was only 90 feet tall. So the Great Pyramid was more than 5 times the height of the tallest structure that Abraham had seen in his life. As we go through these pictures, you're going to notice that the Egyptians did not think small when they built things. One of the main reasons they were able to build so many things on such a massive scale is that much of the country's labor force had nothing to do for 6 months of the year. The Nile had 2 flood seasons that lasted for 3 months each. So during these times, the farmers could not work their land. And to avoid having a restless workforce, the government and religion put them to work. So what we're looking at here is the Pyramid of Zoser. This is that first pyramid I had mentioned in the last slide. And as you can see, there's a reason why this is called the step pyramid. It looks like a series of steps, and it's not as smooth as the Great Pyramid. And just to give you a better idea of the scale here, we can see how small this tourist is in relation to the pyramid. This person looks pretty tiny compared to it. So if you're looking away from the step pyramid, this is the view in modern Egypt. And one thing that really stood out to me is how, coming from the Nile, the land is incredibly fertile, things are really green, and then it just suddenly stops. And this would have been what it was like even back in ancient Egypt, that the land would be fertile for quite a ways due to the flooding, and then it would just suddenly stop and become barren, like what we see here. So it was common for the places with these pyramids to have other tombs in the area. A big reason for this was it was just a good place to be buried and have your tomb. But there was more to it than that. The Egyptians believed that the pharaohs were gods, so to be buried next to a god it was believed that that would help you in the afterlife if you were buried in near proximity to the gods. The pyramids of Giza were built during the 4th dynasty and would have been around for quite some time by the time Abraham went to Egypt. They were actually originally covered in limestone, which means they would have glowed in the sunlight and the moonlight. And the tallest of the 3 was actually the largest man-made structure until the Eiffel Tower was built. So note the scale of these structures and how tiny people are compared to them. It's pretty intimidating today to be around them, and we're used to buildings of this size. This is the age of skyscrapers. In fact, you can even see on the left how the pyramid is so tall they actually have an antenna on the top. It's tall enough for it to be helpful with mass communication. So with this being so large today and so intimidating today, imagine what it would have been like for Abraham to be seeing this. This was 5 times taller than any building he had ever seen. This would be like seeing a building that was 5 times taller than the Empire State Building. So you can see that there is still a little bit of limestone left on one of the pyramids. And one thing you can notice from that is that actually would have smoothed out the pyramids even further than what we see today. And the reason why the limestone came off was due to a number of earthquakes that loosened the limestone casings, causing it all to fall off. And it was actually when other people would rule over Egypt later, they would actually use these bits of limestone to build buildings later on. So the pyramids are actually visible throughout modern Cairo. They tower over the buildings even today. So again, this just gives you the really good scale about how massive these buildings are. No matter where you are, the buildings, these structures are visible. So next to Khufu's pyramid are actually 3 smaller pyramids that he had built for 3 of his favorite wives. They're obviously much smaller than his, but they've still survived to today. And again, it would have been visible to Abraham when he went to Egypt. So the Sphinx would have been seen by Abraham as well, since it was built during the 4th dynasty, just like the pyramids were. And this picture is a little deceiving because it makes the Sphinx look like it's actually fairly small in comparison, but it's much larger than it looks here. So these pictures give a better idea of the scale of the Sphinx. On the picture on the right, we can see that there are 2 people on camel in the background, and they are tiny when compared to the Sphinx. So the temples were a major part of life in ancient Egypt. And while they would have been continued to be built up during the history of Egypt, these pictures will give you a pretty good idea of what Abraham would have seen when he was in Egypt. So again, note how small the people are in comparison to these temples. Everything that the Egyptians did was huge. They did not think small. Even the things that they did that were small were still pretty large in comparison to what other nations did. So statues like this were pretty common in the temples of ancient Egypt, and they were probably some of the smallest things that they had built in the temples. But again, look at the size of them. This statue of the bird is roughly the size of a human being. You can see the person in the background that's approaching looks a little smaller, and by the time he came up to the statue, he was almost as tall as it. So it was still slightly taller than a person, but not much. So even the small things they built were still pretty tall. So in addition to making things that were incredibly large, the Egyptians also made things that were incredibly detailed. So this is writing that was on the walls of the temples. It was pretty common to put the history of Egypt in the temples on the walls and the accomplishment of the pharaohs and to write about the greatness of the nation. So even here the writing was large as well. This was, I mean, you can see how it compares to this person's hand, that what they wrote took up a lot of space. And it's also important to note that all the walls and the statues would have been painted. So in addition to having these massive buildings and these massive statues and writing all over the wall, that all of these things would have been incredibly colorful. One thing that is particularly mind-blowing to me about what the Egyptians did is the immense amount of detail they put in their buildings and in their art. Even things that were as high as this wall and much higher, they still put immensely detailed artwork, not only with the carvings but with the art and the coloring. Even the ceiling here has a lot of art on it, and that was incredibly detailed. So what are some of the things we can learn from Abraham's visit to Egypt? For one, I think this would have been a huge test to Abraham's faith. There would have been signs of wealth everywhere he looked, including places such as the temples, Pharaoh's palace, and especially the fertile land, which would have been great for his cattle. And Genesis 12:16 tells us that he was given lots of wealth before he left, which gives us an idea of just how much wealth was available in the nation. And I think it would have been tempting for him to stay when he would have seen all the opportunities for him to benefit from it on a financial level. And his decision to go to Egypt, to go there for the food, tells us he was drawn to their prosperity. And that I believe he was choosing the wealth of Egypt over the wealth that God was promising him, because he was called to go to the land of Canaan that God had promised him, not to the land of Egypt. But I think the idolatry in Egypt would have been a pretty huge turnoff for him, even if he wasn't caught in the lie and the deception of with Sarah. I believe that he would have eventually have left because of the idolatry. He fled the idolatry in Ur and ended up back here. So I believe he left it once, and I believe he would have left it again. So what can we take away from this for ourselves? So obviously, there are certain parallels between what Egypt has to offer and what we can see in the world today. There's obviously opportunities for us to choose wealth over God. The nations that we live in are always pulling us away, trying to pull us away from God, to rely on ourselves, to rely on the opportunities that are offered by the world, to choose that over God. But we have to be aware of the priorities that God wants us to have, to choose God and his promises over the promises of the world. And just like Abraham made the right choice, so do we. So now let's take a look at what Egypt was like when Joseph went there. When Joseph was there from roughly 1681 BC to 1588 BC. So this covers roughly 100 years of Egyptian history. So let's begin with some history. So Joseph stood before Pharaoh in 1668, and we get this from Genesis chapter 41, verse 46. And he died in Egypt in 1588. So this was during the Second Intermediate Period. And this was a time when the Hyksos had taken over Egypt. And the Hyksos were the 15th dynasty of Egypt. And they ruled from a city called Avaris. Now at the same time was the 16th dynasty. And they acknowledged the Hyksos as their rulers. And they ruled from Thebes, which is also known as Luxor. So this is for the geography fans out there who want to know where Avaris and Thebes were located. So Avaris is in the northeast section of Egypt, and by the Mediterranean, and by an area that would have been heavily involved in trade, with all the areas to the east, to Canaan, and to the areas more to the northeast that go off the map. Thebes, however, was more to the south. So you can see that they weren't particularly close in Egypt, but the 16th dynasty was still acknowledging the Hyksos as their superiors in Egypt at this time. So most of the historical records from this time were actually destroyed when the Egyptians removed the Hyksos from Egypt. And the dates of the pharaohs in this dynasty are educated guesses at best. So we know that the Hyksos were Semitic, like the Hebrews, and rather than make Egypt a Hyksos culture, they decided just to become Egyptian. And the Hyksos did put a policy in place where they let both Egyptians and non-Egyptians rise in society. So this policy would have made the pharaoh much more willing to promote Joseph, even though he was a foreigner. And the Hyksos introduced a few important things to Egypt, which became permanent fixtures of their military: the compound bow, the war horse, and the chariot. These are things that I had always just assumed were always part of Egyptian society, but it was introduced by the Hyksos. So the Hyksos dynasty had 5 or 6 pharaohs. Again, there's some debate among Egyptologists about this, and it's difficult to know since the historical records were destroyed once the Egyptians regained power. But Joseph would have been in the land during the reigns of 4 of them: Salidas, Sekir-Har, Kian, and Apepi, who reigned from approximately 1600 to 1560. So Joseph was born in 1698 BC, which was around the time the Hyksos had taken over Egypt. And he was sold into slavery when he was 17 in 1681. So this would have been roughly 15 to 20 years into the Hyksos dynasty. So Joseph lived for about 80 years after becoming the vizier, and he died in 1588 BC, which was about 40 years before the Hyksos were removed from Egypt. And 1588 was about 62 years before Moses was born. So there are some pretty important things that Joseph would have seen and experienced while in Egypt. As the vizier, he would have been intimately aware of the nation's wealth, the nation's military, the nation's bureaucracy, and the nation's religion. And he would have been pretty familiar with the criminal justice system as well, due to his time in prison. So knowing about some Egyptian customs actually provides insights into Scripture. For example, Genesis chapter 50, verses 2 and 3 says, "And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. And the physicians embalmed Israel. And 40 days were fulfilled for him. For so are fulfilled the days of those which are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 80 days." So embalming in Egypt could take any of 3 lengths of time, depending on who you were and how much money you had. For the poor and the commoners, the embalming process was 7 days. For the rich and the nobility, it would be 40 days. And for the pharaohs and the royalty, the process was 70 days. So we see that Jacob's embalming process was the same as it was for the rich and the members of the nobility. However, he was mourned as if he were royalty. So as vizier, Joseph would have traveled the entire land of Egypt. He would have gone to all the major cities, and he would have seen everything in between the cities. He would have spent a lot of time in Avaris and Thebes, since they were the 2 capitals of the country. And he would have been educated in Egypt, which would have meant he would have learned the language, and he would have spent quite a bit of time in the temples, not just for the relationship between government and religion, but also because the temples were also schools. So that's where he would have gone to learn the language. He also would have been a wealthy man, since he was number 2 to the pharaoh. He was the first, second only to the pharaoh. Also, his father-in-law was the Prince of On, which is also known as Heliopolis. So he would have been an incredibly well-connected man and would have been intimately familiar with how the nation worked. So the Temple of Luxor would have been something Joseph would have seen during his time as vizier. So again, note the scale of the building. You can see the buildings in the background from modern day Egypt, and this front wall here of the temple and the obelisk are massive structures, and so are those statues in the front. So like everything else in Egypt, these temples would have been huge, including the Temple of Luxor. You can see how the walls and these pillars just tower over everyone that's walking through it. through the temple. It would have towered over Joseph as well. It would have really driven home the resources and the wealth of the nation that he was running. And for him to be such a powerful man in Egypt, it would have been incredibly tempting for him to just embrace this way of thinking, to embrace Egyptian thinking. So again, we can see how even the statues and the pillars just tower over the people that are in the temple. I mean, just the bases for the statues are almost as tall as a person. And then the statues themselves are just massive in comparison. And as I mentioned earlier, all of these walls and statues would have been painted as well. So this would have made the buildings and statues that much more impressive. So this gives you another idea of just how huge everything is. That to get the pillars and statues into the frame, you can only see the very top of the people's heads. And there's a massive scaffolding in the background too. Again, everything here is just massive and detailed. So this is a picture of what the chariots in Egypt would have looked like. Obviously, there'd be some coverings, things to stand on, things in front of the transportation area that they stood on, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what they would have looked like, and obviously would have been connected to horses. But this is something that Joseph would have traveled on as he went through the nation. So Joseph would have had immense wealth and power at his command, and it would have been easy for him to embrace Egyptian thinking. But it's important to note that he never forgot the promises God made to his family. In Genesis chapter 40, verse 15, when he's in Egypt, he referred to Canaan as the land of the Hebrews. By contrast, his brothers said they were from the land of Canaan when they went to Egypt to buy food. So clearly they did not have this belief in God in the same way Joseph did. And Joseph saw God's hand in his life in both the hard times and the easy times. And when he could have taken revenge on his brothers, he forgave them without hesitation. So again, it's important for us to think of how we can take on this mindset ourselves, even when things are going well for us, especially when things are going well for us, when we have the ability to and freedom to do what we want. We need to have this focus on the promises of God, where we are remembering how we are citizens of the kingdom of God now, as well as in the future, so that we are thinking about how we are part of that kingdom now, in the same way Joseph did, rather than identify with the world around us like his brothers did. So now let's take a look at what Egypt was like during the time of Moses. It's time for another history lesson. So around 1550 BC, the Egyptians removed the Hyksos from Egypt and took back the land. And when they regained power, there was a strong anti-foreigner sentiment in the nation and in the government. So this is when the Jews would have been oppressed. And it was during this time that Moses was born in 1526. And he lived as a prince in Egypt until 1486. So during the life of Moses, when he was born, Amhos I was at the end of his reign, and his son Amenhotep I was the next pharaoh. So both Ahmose and Amenhotep started massive building projects during their reign. They added to many temples in cities such as Heliopolis, Memphis, Abydos, and Thebes. So after Amenhotep I was Thutmose I, who reigned from 1504 to 1492, and he began some military expansion. Conquered people, he was showing off his might, and at the same time, he continued to build up the temples. This was something that every pharaoh did if they were able to put wealth into the temples. So Thutmose II reigned from 1492 to 1479, and he would have been pharaoh when Moses left Egypt. and he had military campaigns in Canaan and was married to Queen Hatshepsut. So Thutmose III was the pharaoh of the Exodus. He officially became pharaoh in 1479. However, he was incredibly young, and Hatshepsut was the queen regent, and she actually declared herself pharaoh for a while. She's a fascinating person to study, but I'll let you do that on your own. Um, so Thutmose Moses III, his reign lasted until 1426, and he came into his own in 1458 after the death of Queen Hatshepsut. So he performed a number of successful military campaigns that considerably strengthened Egypt. So the military campaigns and the building up of the nation's wealth during the reign of Thutmose III and his predecessors were important for a few reasons. The most important of which, on a scriptural basis, is the fact that the their strength and how strong they had become made their fall that much more dramatic during the plagues and during the Exodus. It would have made the reputation of God that much stronger by the time the Jews got to the land of Canaan. So it's important to understand the role of temples in ancient Egypt. They're obviously centers of worship for the Egyptians, but they also served as temples, and as I had mentioned earlier, there are also schools. That's where people were educated. So it's important to understand that it served all three of these purposes at the same time. So the Temple of Karnak was particularly important to Egyptian religion. It was the center of their religion. It was kind of the Egyptian equivalent of the Vatican. So this was also where the royal family received their education, and Moses would have been educated here when he was growing up as a prince. This would have been his school, and the entire complex is massive. It's a 200-acre temple, and there's an area dedicated to the Egyptian god Ammon, which is 61 acres, and this section alone could contain 10 cathedrals. So what Moses would have seen would have been pretty similar to what Joseph would have experienced. Some differences, though. Egypt was at one of its peaks in terms of wealth and military strength. And during the time since Joseph's life, the temples would have become even more magnificent. There would have been more wealth in the nation. There would have been more slaves for him at his beck and call. It would have been incredibly easy for him to want to continue with this lifestyle. And it really adds weight to when we're told that Moses chose God over the pleasures of Egypt. So we're going to look at the Temple of Karnak in the next few slides, and this is a picture of the entrance. And one of the reasons we're going to spend some time with Karnak is because I believe this would have been a place that would have left a huge impact on Moses. He grew up in this temple. He would have been a child seeing how huge everything was, seeing these sphinxes that were outside it along this road that led to the temple. He would have been a child seeing these massive walls and all of the statues and the pillars that we're going to be seeing. So as we go through this, try to think of what it would have been like to grow up here and to be surrounded by this when you're a child. So this is what you see when you walk into the Temple of Karnak. You walk through these massive walls on each side that we had just seen. And then as you walk through, there's a huge courtyard followed by another set of huge walls directly in front of you. So you're just completely surrounded by this architecture. So here's a picture of part of the courtyard. You see that there's more of these sphinxes on both sides, both the left and the right, with these big pillars behind it, and these are actually pretty small pillars compared to what they have in a different section of the temple. So again, he would have been surrounded by these massive objects that would have been highly detailed and painted. So again, here are things that would have been seen by Moses, these massive statues like what we see on the left, and then these massive obelisks that we see on the right, that would all of which again would have been highly detailed and had writing all the way to the top of the obelisks, and it just would have really left a huge impact on him, both as a child, a teenager, and as an adult. So while there were open areas in this temple, there was no escaping just the massive scale of everything that was there. I mean, no matter where you went, there were these walls, there were obelisks, there were big doorways that you can see on the left. Everywhere you went, you were surrounded by the wealth of Egypt, the wealth of their religion. So everywhere you went, you could see what was at Egypt's disposal. And for Moses to be growing up knowing he was a prince, that he had this wealth at his disposal, it would have been easy for him, just like Joseph, to embrace it. And in a lot of ways, it probably would have been even easier for Moses to embrace it because he grew up in this. He knew this from birth. Joseph grew up with Isaac. He would have known about God. He was taught this for much more of his life than what Moses would have experienced. Moses was taught about the Egyptian gods, and it would have been incredibly easy if he had wanted to for him to embrace Egypt and stay there. So these pillars would have been another thing that would have probably really kind of overwhelmed Moses especially when he was young, just seeing how huge these things were. You can even see here just how much taller they are than the people standing by them. The lady in the front is actually using it to kind of rest on for the base of the pillar. It shows you how tall it is, and they just dwarf everyone that's in there. So, and you can see how detailed the writing is on there, and especially when you picture it covered with some pretty brightly colored paints, you can just imagine how this would have looked during the time of Moses. So the Nile was something that Abraham, Joseph, and Moses all would have seen, because the Nile was the center of life in Egypt, because everything depended on it. The flood seasons made the land fertile and allowed them to grow crops and feed their cattle. And it was a major form of transportation for them, that they would transport things up and down the Nile to get things from one side of Egypt to the next. So this picture gives a pretty great visual about how lush and fertile the land was by the Nile River. I mean, all you can see here is green in every direction, and it would have been great land for the Egyptians to farm. And we're going to see how it's still used for farming and for cattle raising even today. So here we can see how even today that the land by the Nile is used to raise cattle. And you see how this area is covered with animals that are being raised. So what are some of the lessons that we can get from knowing what Moses would have seen in Egypt? Well, Hebrews 11, verses 24 through 27 tells us, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who was invisible. So everything we looked at was just a glimpse of what Moses would have experienced while he was a prince in Egypt. As a member of the ruling elite, he would have had access to much of the nation's wealth and power. It would have been incredibly easy for him to justify staying in Egypt. I mean, after all, he was raised in this culture. It was, in a lot of ways, I mean, it shaped him. He was educated in this country. He had access to everything. Much in the same way we are. We are raised in the world. We are educated by the world. Yet we read that he esteemed the reproach of Christ greater than the treasures in Egypt, and he forsook Egypt because of this. He chose to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. How often do we make this choice ourselves? How often do we put the things of God above the pleasures of sin? So what are some takeaways that we can get from Abraham, Joseph, and Moses? Well, it would have been a temptation for all three of them. For Abraham, Egypt appeared to be a source of food and security, quite the contrast to the famine in Canaan. For Joseph and Moses, it would have been the temptations that come with wealth and power. So despite these temptations, all three saw Egypt for what it was, a tribute to man. So how willing are we, in a world that has a number of similarities to Egypt, to turn down what the world has to offer? Because one advantage we have that was lacking in Abraham, Joseph, and Moses' life is that we have the ecclesia, we have each other, and we have access to the fellowship that comes with that. So let us make use of this fellowship and strengthen each other's faith so that we will be more tempted to embrace the treasures of God rather than the treasures of the world.